The silence in the lawyer's office was deafening as I slid the manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. Inside were the deed transfer documents I'd spent months preparing. The papers that would have made my daughter the sole owner of the 4-bedroom colonial house she'd grown up in. The same house where she'd just told me I wasn't welcome for Thanksgiving because her new husband didn't want me there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Blackwood?" Attorney Mitchell asked, his weathered hands hovering over the documents that would change everything. I thought about Emma's cold voice on the phone 3 days earlier, how she delivered the news like she was discussing the weather, how her tone had carried not a trace of the warmth I'd spent 32 years nurturing. Then I thought about the man who'd turned my loving daughter into someone I barely recognized. "I'm certain," I whispered, watching him tear up papers worth $300,000. The October rain hammered against my kitchen windows as I stood at the sink, mechanically washing the same coffee mug for the 3rd time. My hands moved without purpose, while my mind replayed the conversation that had shattered my world just 48 hours earlier. The mug slipped from my soapy fingers, cracking against the porcelain with a sound that seemed to echo through every corner of the house. This house, the house Robert and I had saved for years to buy, where we'd brought Emma home from the hospital as a tiny, perfect bundle, where she'd taken her first steps across the hardwood floors of the living room, where we'd measured her height against the kitchen door frame every birthday, marking her growth with pencil lines that were still there, faded but visible if you knew where to look. The house that was supposed to be hers. I picked up the broken pieces of the mug carefully, each shard catching the gray afternoon light filtering through the gauze curtains Emma had helped me hang just 2 summers ago. Back when she still called me every morning to check in, back when she dropped by unannounced with coffee and stories from her marketing job, back when I was still Mom instead of whatever I'd become since she married Trevor Sullivan. The phone had rung Tuesday evening while I was preparing my weekly lesson plans. 27 years of teaching 5th grade had trained me to multitask, so I'd answered without looking away from the mathematics worksheets spread across my dining room table. "Hi, Mom." Emma's voice had carried an unusual tension, a careful control that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Any morning sickness today?" I'd been so excited about becoming a grandmother, about having a grandchild to spoil and love unconditionally the way I'd loved Emma. "I'm fine. Listen, Mom, I need to talk to you about Thanksgiving." I'd set down my red pen and given her my full attention, the way I always had when she needed to discuss something important. "Of course. Are you thinking of switching to that stuffing recipe your grandmother used to make? I found the handwritten card in her recipe box last week." The pause that followed should have warned me. It stretched too long, filled with the kind of weighted silence that precedes life-changing announcements. "Actually, Trevor and I have decided to host Thanksgiving at our place this year. Just us and his parents. We want to start our own family traditions now that we're married and expecting." The words had hit me like cold water. I'd lowered myself into one of the dining room chairs slowly, my legs suddenly unsteady. "Oh, well, that's wonderful that you want to host. I can bring the green bean casserole and help you with the turkey prep. You know how tricky the timing can be with a big meal." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, you don't understand. We want it to be just our immediate family. Trevor's parents, him, me, and the baby. We're not inviting extended family this year." Extended family. The phrase had lodged in my throat like a fishbone. Extended family, as if the woman who'd carried her for 9 months, who'd walked the floors with her during colicky nights, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to pay for Emma's college education, was somehow peripheral to her life now. "Emma, I don't understand. We've never spent Thanksgiving apart, not once in 32 years. I know, but things are different now. Trevor feels it's important for us to establish our independence as a couple. He says it's healthy to set boundaries with parents and focus on building our nuclear family unit. Trevor feels. Trevor says, when had my daughter's decisions become so thoroughly influenced by someone else's opinions? When had the confident, independent young woman I'd raised started speaking in someone else's voice? Sweetheart, I respect that you're married now, but I'm not trying to interfere with your independence. It's just Thanksgiving dinner, one meal with your mother. It's not just one meal, though. Trevor pointed out that you've been pretty clingy since we got married, always calling, always dropping by unannounced. He thinks some distance might be good for us all. Clingy. The word had felt like a slap across the face. I'd called her every few days to check in, the same way I'd done since she moved out for college. I'd stopped by her apartment maybe twice a month, usually bringing groceries or helping with household tasks. The same supportive relationship we'd maintained for a decade. Emma, I had no idea you felt that way about my calls. You never said anything. I don't feel that way. Trevor just thinks that maybe we've been too dependent on each other, and now that he's my husband, he should be my primary support system. My primary support system. As if love operated on some kind of hierarchical chart where marriage automatically erased the bonds between mother and daughter. I'd sat in that dining room chair, staring at the lesson plans scattered across the table, trying to understand how the relationship I'd treasured most in my life had become something problematic in the eyes of a man I barely knew. Can we compromise? Maybe I could come for dessert, or we could celebrate the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. This is our decision, and we need you to respect it. We'll see you at Christmas, of course. Christmas. As if that made the rejection of Thanksgiving less painful. As if holidays were interchangeable appointments that could be rescheduled at will. The conversation had continued for another few minutes, but the rest was a blur of stilted pleasantries and careful politeness. When I'd finally hung up, I'd sat in the growing darkness of the dining room until nearly midnight, too stunned to move, too hurt to cry. Now, 48 hours later, the full impact of that conversation was settling into my bones like arthritis. I swept the broken mug pieces into the dustpan with mechanical precision. My hands moved without purpose, while my mind replayed the conversation that had shattered my world just 48 hours earlier. The living room where Emma had practiced piano recitals, her small fingers stumbling over scales while I offered patient encouragement. The den where we'd built blanket forts during snow days, reading Harry Potter books aloud until my voice grew hoarse. The kitchen where she'd stood on a step stool beside me, learning to crack eggs and measure flour for Sunday morning pancakes. All of it meaningless now, apparently. Clingy behavior, according to Trevor Sullivan. I'd met Trevor exactly 4 times before Emma married him in a small ceremony last spring. 4 brief encounters that had left me with an uneasy feeling I'd struggled to articulate, even to myself. There was something about the way he dominated conversations, the way he subtly corrected Emma when she spoke, the way his charm felt performative rather than genuine. The first time had been at Emma's birthday dinner in March. I'd taken them to Grayson's, the upscale restaurant downtown that Emma had always loved for special occasions. Trevor had arrived 20 minutes late without apology, then spent the first half hour of dinner taking calls from work that he claimed couldn't wait. "I'm sorry," he'd said after the third interruption, finally putting his phone in his jacket pocket. "Crisis management in commercial real estate never sleeps, but I'm all yours now, ladies." Emma had beamed at him with such obvious adoration that my concerns had felt petty. Young love, I'd told myself. He was probably just nervous about meeting his girlfriend's mother. But as the evening progressed, I'd noticed how he redirected every conversation back to himself. When Emma mentioned her promotion at the marketing firm, He'd launched into a detailed explanation of his own recent success closing a major property deal. When I'd asked about his family, he'd spent 15 minutes describing his father's investment portfolio and his mother's charity work with the Junior League. "Emma tells me you're a teacher," he'd said finally, as if suddenly remembering I was there. "Elementary school, right? That must be rewarding in its own way." Rewarding in its own way. The phrase had carried just enough condescension to sting without being overtly rude. I'd taught some of the brightest, most innovative minds in our school district. I'd been named Teacher of the Year twice and had developed reading programs that were adopted by other schools, had touched hundreds of lives in ways that extended far beyond test scores and report cards. "I love working with children," I'd replied simply. "There's something magical about watching a student's face light up when a concept finally clicks." He'd nodded with the polite indifference of someone acknowledging a hobby they found mildly quaint. "Emma's mentioned you're planning to retire soon. That'll give you plenty of time for other interests." Other interests. As if 30 years of dedicated teaching was just a way to pass time until retirement provided more meaningful pursuits. The second meeting had been worse. Emma had invited me to their new apartment for dinner, eager to show off her first real home with Trevor. The space was beautiful, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than a place where people actually lived. "Trevor picked out most of the furniture," Emma had said proudly, running her hand along the back of a leather sofa that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. "He has such incredible taste." I'd noticed how few traces of Emma's personality existed in the space. The vintage jewelry box she'd inherited from my mother was nowhere to be seen. The colorful artwork she'd collected during college had been replaced by stark black and white photographs of architectural details. Even her beloved books, hundreds of novels and memoirs she'd accumulated since childhood, were absent from the sterile living room. "Where did you put your book collection, sweetheart?" "Oh, Trevor suggested we donate most of them. He says keeping too many material possessions creates negative energy in a living space. We kept the classics, of course." The classics, according to Trevor's definition, apparently consisted of about 20 leather-bound volumes arranged on a single shelf like decorative objects rather than treasured companions. During dinner, I'd watched him correct her pronunciation of a wine varietal, saw how she'd immediately deferred to his expertise despite having enjoyed wine for years before meeting him. I'd noticed how she'd asked his permission before serving herself a second helping of the pasta she had prepared. "This is delicious, Emma. Did you use that basil from the little herb garden you started on your balcony?" "Actually, Trevor suggested we order the pasta from that Italian place downtown. He thought it would be better than anything I could make from scratch." She'd said it without any apparent awareness of how dismissive the comment was to her own cooking abilities. My daughter, who'd been preparing elaborate meals since high school, who had once catered a dinner party for 12 with confidence and creativity, now believed her homemade pasta wasn't good enough for a simple family dinner? The third encounter had been the engagement announcement lunch in April. Emma had been radiant, practically vibrating with excitement as she'd shown me the ring Trevor had chosen. It was beautiful, certainly, a flawless solitaire that caught light from every angle, but it was also cold somehow, impressive rather than intimate. "We're thinking of a small wedding," she had said, "just immediate family and a few close friends. Trevor believes elaborate weddings are a waste of money that could be better invested in our future." I'd agreed that intimate weddings could be lovely, though I'd secretly hoped for something that reflected more of Emma's personality. She had always talked about wanting to be married outdoors, maybe in the botanical gardens where we'd spent so many afternoons when she was young. She dreamed of wildflowers and string lights, of dancing under the stars with everyone she loved. Instead, they'd chosen the private dining room at Trevor's country club, a formal affair with ivory roses and chamber music. Beautiful, but utterly lacking in the warmth and joy Emma had always associated with celebrating life's important moments. The fourth time I'd met Trevor had been at the wedding itself, where I had barely spoken to him beyond the receiving line pleasantries. He'd been charming and attentive to Emma, I had to admit, but there was something performative about his behavior that left me feeling like I was watching a carefully rehearsed play rather than witnessing genuine emotion. Now, standing in my kitchen on this gray October afternoon, those four encounters played through my memory with new clarity. I could see the pattern I'd missed at the time, or maybe chosen not to see because I'd wanted so desperately for Emma to be happy. The subtle undermining of her confidence, the gradual isolation from her own interests and possessions, the way her vocabulary had shifted to include his phrases, his perspectives, his judgments, the transformation of my vibrant, independent daughter into someone who needed permission to serve herself dinner in her own home. I'd dismissed my concerns as typical mother-of-the-bride anxiety, normal adjustment fears that came with watching your child commit to marriage. I'd told myself that Trevor made Emma happy, and that was all that mattered. I'd convinced myself that my unease was just the natural resistance of a mother learning to share her daughter with another family. But Trevor wasn't sharing Emma, he was claiming her, systematically erasing the bonds that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. For a moment, my heart leapt with hope. Maybe Emma was calling to apologize, to explain that she'd made a mistake, that of course I was welcome for Thanksgiving. Instead, I heard my sister Caroline's voice, warm with concern. "Margaret, I just tried calling Emma to confirm what time to arrive on Thursday, and she told me Thanksgiving was canceled. What's going on?" I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly exhausted. Caroline lived 3 hours away in Portland, but she'd made the drive every Thanksgiving for the past 15 years, ever since her divorce. Emma adored her aunt, had always looked forward to their annual tradition of making cranberry sauce together while sharing gossip and laughing at Caroline's stories from her job as a travel writer. "It's not canceled exactly. Emma and Trevor are hosting their own celebration, just the two of them and his parents." The silence on Caroline's end spoke volumes. She'd met Trevor at the wedding, had spent exactly 10 minutes making polite conversation before pulling me aside with barely concealed alarm. "That man talks about your daughter like she's a business acquisition, all strategy and return on investment. Where's the love, Margaret?"
Where's the joy? At the time, I'd brushed off her concerns. Caroline had never married again after her divorce, had developed a somewhat cynical view of relationships that I'd attributed to her own romantic disappointments. But now her words echoed in my memory with uncomfortable accuracy. "Did she say why the sudden change?" Caroline asked now. "Trevor thinks I've been too clingy, too dependent. He believes they need space to establish their independence." Clingy? Margaret, you're the least clingy person I know. You raised Emma to be independent, for God's sake. You encouraged her to study abroad in college, even though you missed her terribly. You supported her decision to move to the city for her job instead of staying closer to home. What does he consider clingy behavior? Calling to check in? Stopping by occasionally? Being a mother, essentially. Caroline's sharp intake of breath told me she understood the full implications of what I was describing. This isn't about independence, Margaret. This is about control. He's isolating her from her support system. The word isolation hit me like a physical blow. I thought about Emma's missing book collection, her abandoned herb garden, her friends who'd gradually disappeared from her conversation over the past year. Sarah from college, who'd been Emma's maid of honor, but whom I hadn't heard mentioned in months. Jennifer from work, Emma's former lunch companion and confidant. Even Marcus, the neighbor who'd become a genuine friend and had helped Emma move into 3 different apartments over the years. When had Emma stopped mentioning the people who'd been important to her? When had her world contracted to include only Trevor and his circle of approved relationships? "What are you going to do about Thanksgiving?" Caroline asked gently. "I don't know. maybe I'll visit you in Portland, or just stay here and grade papers. Or maybe, Caroline said, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to suggest something I wouldn't like hearing. Maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe it's time to stop enabling this behavior and start setting some boundaries of your own. What do you mean? I mean, Margaret, that you've been bending over backward to accommodate Trevor's demands for the past year. You've bitten your tongue when he dismissed your career, stayed quiet when he erased Emma's personality from their apartment, smiled politely when he treated you like a nuisance to be managed. Maybe it's time to remind them both that respect is a two-way street. After Caroline hung up, I sat in the growing twilight of my kitchen, turning her words over in my mind. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a home that had weathered decades of joy and sorrow, celebration and quiet grief. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house, the thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing. The master bedroom, where Robert and I had planned Emma's future, lying awake on countless nights discussing college funds and career guidance and how to raise a daughter who would know her own worth. The spare room that had been Emma's nursery, then her bedroom, then her study space when she'd moved home after college to save money for her first apartment. Every corner held memories we'd created together. Every surface bore the patina of our shared life. This house. The thought came to me suddenly with crystalline clarity. I walked through the room slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room, where Emma had unwrapped Christmas presents for 32 years, her excitement filling the space with warmth even during the difficult years after Robert's death. The dining room, where we'd hosted birthday parties and graduation celebrations, where Emma had brought friends and boyfriends for my approval and blessing.
Tomorrow, I would show Emma what it really meant to establish independence and set boundaries. The rain continued to fall against the windows, but inside the house that had sheltered 3 generations of my family, I felt warm and determined for the first time in months. Whatever came next, I would face it as the strong, capable woman I'd always been, not as the apologetic inconvenience Trevor had convinced Emma I'd become. The woman who'd raised Emma to know her own worth was about to remember her own. Attorney Mitchell's office occupied the 2nd floor of a renovated Victorian mansion downtown, its tall windows overlooking the town square where Emma and I used to feed ducks when she was small. The irony wasn't lost on me as I climbed the narrow staircase, carrying documents that would fundamentally alter the future I'd spent decades planning.
The waiting room smelled of leather and lemon oil, furnished with antiques that spoke of old money and established tradition. I'd never felt entirely comfortable in spaces like this, places where my teacher's salary and modest background seemed obvious despite my best efforts to fit in. But today, I held my head high as I announced myself to the receptionist. Mrs. Blackwood to see Mr. Mitchell at 10 o'clock. Jennifer, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, gestured toward one of the leather chairs. "He'll be right with you. Would you like some coffee or tea while you wait?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you." As she busied herself with the coffee service, I studied the oil paintings lining the walls. Hunting scenes and pastoral landscapes, the kind of art that suggested respectability and conservative values. Robert would have made some gentle joke about the pretentiousness of it all, would have found a way to put me at ease with his quiet humor. I missed him with a sharp intensity that still caught me off guard, even 15 years after his death. Robert would have known exactly what to say to Emma about Trevor. He would have seen through the charm and manipulation with the clarity that came from his years as a social worker, dealing with troubled families and dysfunctional relationships. He also would have supported my decision to reconsider the deed transfer, I realized. Robert had believed in consequences, in the importance of treating people with dignity and respect. He never would have tolerated being dismissed and excluded from his own daughter's life. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Mr. Mitchell emerged from his inner office, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "So good to see you again. Please come in." His office was even more impressive than the waiting room, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive desk that dominated the space. Behind him, diplomas and certificates covered one wall, testament to decades of legal practice in our small city. "I have to say, I was surprised by your call yesterday," he said, settling into his leather transfer documents in the spring. "You seemed quite certain about your decision." I placed my purse carefully on the chair beside me, buying myself a moment to organize my thoughts. "Circumstances have changed, Mr. Mitchell. My relationship with my daughter has evolved in ways I didn't anticipate." His eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And you're reconsidering the transfer?" "I'm reconsidering everything." The words came out more firmly than I'd expected, carrying a conviction that surprised me. Emma has made it clear that she views my role in her life as excessive and unwelcome. Her new husband believes I'm too involved, too dependent, too clingy. They've asked me not to attend Thanksgiving dinner because they want to establish boundaries. Mr. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine concern. "That must be very painful for you." "It is, but it's also clarifying." I opened my purse and removed the manila folder containing the deed documents. "I've been operating under the assumption that love means giving unconditionally, even when that generosity isn't appreciated or reciprocated. I'm beginning to think that approach may have been misguided." He accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. "What specifically would you like to do, Mrs. Blackwood?" "I want to tear up those papers. I want to ensure that the house remains in my name, under my control for the foreseeable future." "That's certainly your right," he said carefully, "but I want to make sure you've thought through the implications. Estate planning isn't just about current relationships. It's about long-term financial security and family legacy." "Mr. Mitchell, I'm 57 years old. I'm in excellent health, I have a solid pension plan, and I own my house outright. My financial security doesn't depend on giving away my most valuable asset to someone who doesn't want me in her life." The strength in my own voice surprised me. For months, I'd felt diminished by Emma's growing distance, uncertain about my place in her new life. But sitting in this office, articulating my position clearly, I felt like myself again for the first time since Trevor Sullivan had entered our lives. "What about your daughter's financial security?" he asked. "When we discussed this originally, you mentioned wanting to ensure she had stability for her future." "Emma has chosen to prioritize her husband's opinions over her relationship with her mother. She's chosen to exclude me from important family events because her spouse finds my presence inconvenient. Those are her choices, and she has every right to make them. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. But choices have consequences. If Emma doesn't want me to be part of her family, then perhaps she shouldn't expect to inherit the family assets I've spent my life accumulating. Mr. Mitchell opened the folder and scanned the documents, his expression thoughtful. These papers represent a significant financial gift. Are you certain you want to revoke them based on a single incident? This isn't about a single incident. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been developing for months. Emma has been slowly but systematically cutting me out of her life at her husband's encouragement. The Thanksgiving exclusion is just the most recent example. I thought about Caroline's words, about enabling behavior and the importance of setting boundaries. I raised Emma to be independent and self-sufficient, but I also raised her to value family relationships and treat people with respect. If she's forgotten those lessons, maybe it's time for her to remember them. And you believe revoking this deed transfer will accomplish that? I believe, I said slowly, that Emma needs to understand what she's choosing when she chooses Trevor's priorities over our relationship. She needs to see that actions have consequences and that taking family for granted is a luxury she can't afford indefinitely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers spread across his desk. Mrs. Blackwood, I've been practicing family law for 30 years, and I've seen many situations like this. Adult children who become estranged from their parents, often due to the influence of spouses or partners. In my experience, punitive measures rarely heal these rifts. I'm not trying to punish Emma, I said, though even as I spoke, I wondered if that was entirely true. I'm trying to protect myself from further hurt while also giving her an opportunity to reconsider her choices. How so? Emma has been taking our relationship for granted because she knows I'll always be there, always available, always willing to accept whatever scraps of attention she's willing to offer. Maybe if she faces the real possibility of losing what I've been planning to give her, she'll recognize the value of what she's been discarding. He nodded slowly. That's possible. It's also possible that this action could deepen the rift between you permanently. The possibility had occurred to me, of course. Lying awake the night before, I'd imagined various scenarios. Emma could respond with anger, could see my decision as confirmation of Trevor's narrative about my being difficult and manipulative. She could cut off contact entirely, could move forward with her life without looking back. But she could also wake up. She could recognize that her behavior had been hurtful and unfair. She could remember the woman who'd raised her, who'd sacrificed for her, who'd loved her unconditionally for 32 years. She could choose to fight for our relationship instead of abandoning it. Either way, I would know where I stood. Either way, I would stop living in the liminal space of not knowing whether I mattered to my own daughter. Mr. Mitchell, I spent 15 years as a single mother, working full-time while raising Emma alone. I made sacrifices she'll never fully understand because I wanted her to have every opportunity for success and happiness. I've supported every dream, every goal, every relationship she's ever pursued, even when I had reservations. I paused, thinking about Trevor, about the way Emma's light seemed dimmer when she was with him. The only thing I've ever asked in return is to remain part of her life, not to control her choices or interfere with her marriage, just to maintain the loving relationship we've always shared. If that's too much to ask, if loving me has become such a burden that she can't include me in holiday celebrations, then maybe we both need to reassess our expectations. He tapped his pen against the desk thoughtfully. What will you tell her about this decision? I'm not going to tell her anything, at least not immediately. Emma has made it clear that she needs space and independence. I'm giving her exactly what she's asked for. And If she asks about the deed transfer later, then I'll explain that circumstances changed, that I decided to maintain control of my assets until I'm certain they'll be appreciated rather than simply expected. Mr. Mitchell pulled out a legal pad and began writing notes. I'll need to prepare some additional documentation to formally revoke the transfer. It will take a few days to complete the paperwork. That's fine. I've waited 57 years to own a home outright. I think I can hold on to it a bit longer. As he continued writing, I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there. The deed transfer had felt like an obligation, a maternal duty to ensure Emma's security. Removing that obligation felt like reclaiming something essential about myself. Mrs. Blackwood, may I ask what you plan to do for Thanksgiving? The question caught me off guard. I'm not sure. My sister invited me to Portland, but I may just stay home. It's been years since I've had a completely quiet holiday. That sounds restful. He finished his notes and looked up at me. For what it's worth, I think you're handling a difficult situation with considerable grace. Family dynamics are never simple, especially when new marriages change established relationships. Thank you. That means more than you know. As I left his office, walking back out into the crisp October air, I felt like I was seeing my town with new eyes. The tree-lined streets where I'd pushed Emma's stroller, the shops where we'd browsed for school clothes and birthday presents, the coffee shop where we'd met for lunch during her college breaks. All of it looked the same, but my relationship to these places had shifted somehow. I wasn't just the mother of Emma Blackwood anymore. I wasn't defined solely by my role as caregiver and supporter. I was Margaret Blackwood, property owner, career educator, woman of substance in my own right. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. That evening, I called Caroline to tell her about my decision to revoke the deed transfer. She listened without interruption as I explained my reasoning, the legal process, and my hopes for what might come next. "I'm proud of you," she said when I finished. "It took courage to make that choice." Did it? Or did it take selfishness? I keep wondering if I'm doing this for Emma's benefit or for my own ego. "Maybe it's both," Caroline said. "Maybe the healthiest relationships require a balance of selflessness and self-respect. You've been so focused on Emma's needs and happiness that you've forgotten to protect your own emotional well-being." Her words resonated with a truth I'd been avoiding for months. I had forgotten to protect my own emotional well-being, had become so focused on maintaining my connection with Emma that I had allowed myself to be diminished by degrees. "What if she never calls again?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking beneath every decision I'd made since Tuesday night. "Then you'll know where you stand, and you can build a life that doesn't revolve around waiting for crumbs of attention from someone who doesn't value what you're offering." The harshness of Caroline's words stung, but they also carried the clarity I needed to hear. I'd been living in a state of suspended animation, organizing my days around Emma's schedule, measuring my worth by her approval, accepting less and less, while telling myself that any connection was better than none. "I'm coming to Portland for Thanksgiving," I said suddenly, "if you'll still have me." "Of course I'll have you. We'll cook too much food, drink too much wine, and watch terrible holiday movies until we fall asleep on the couch. It'll be perfect." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen, looking around at the familiar space with new appreciation. This was my home, bought with my money, maintained through my efforts, filled with memories I'd created through decades of living fully and loving deeply. Whatever happened with Emma, this place would remain mine. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and distraction. I threw myself into my teaching with renewed energy, spending extra time with students who needed additional support, staying late to organize classroom supplies and update bulletin boards. Work had always been my refuge during difficult times, and the routine of lesson plans and grading provided structure for my scattered emotions. On Friday afternoon, as I was packing books into my canvas bag, my principal, Mrs. Henderson, knocked on my classroom door.
Margaret, do you have a minute? Patricia Henderson had been principal at Oakwood Elementary for 8 years, but we'd known each other much longer. Her daughter had been in Emma's class in high school, and our families had maintained a casual friendship through school events and community activities. Of course, what can I do for you? She stepped into the classroom, closing the door behind her. I wanted to talk to you about the literacy initiative proposal you submitted last month. The school board reviewed it at their meeting Wednesday night. I'd forgotten about the proposal entirely. In the aftermath of Emma's Thanksgiving announcement, work projects had seemed trivial and distant. The literacy initiative had been my passion project for months, a comprehensive program designed to support struggling readers through individualized intervention and family engagement. They approved it, Patricia continued, her face breaking into a smile. Not only approved it, Margaret, they want to implement it district-wide. They're offering you the position of literacy coordinator, which would mean a significant salary increase and the opportunity to impact reading instruction across all elementary schools. The news should have thrilled me. For years, I dreamed of expanding my influence beyond a single classroom, of developing programs that could help hundreds of children develop strong reading foundations. But in my current emotional state, even good news felt muted and distant. "That's wonderful," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "When would they want me to start?" "January, if you're interested. You'd spend the rest of this school year transitioning out of classroom teaching and developing the implementation timeline." It's a big change, but Patricia, you're the most gifted reading teacher I've ever worked with. These kids need what you have to offer. As she spoke, I found myself thinking about Emma, about how proud she would have been to hear this news just 6 months ago. She'd always celebrated my professional achievements, had been my biggest supporter when I'd pursued my master's degree in reading education. She would have insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate, would have called her friends to brag about her mother's success. Now, I wondered if she'd even care enough to listen if I told her about the promotion. "Can I have the weekend to think about it?" I asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Margaret, I hope you'll say yes. You've been hiding your light under a bushel for too long. It's time to let it shine." That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, considering Patricia's offer. The promotion would mean longer hours, more responsibility, travel between schools. It would also mean less flexibility for the drop-in visits and spontaneous phone calls that Trevor had labeled as clingy behavior. Maybe that was exactly what I needed. Maybe it was time to build a life that didn't revolve around Emma's schedule and availability. I thought about Robert, about the conversation we'd had shortly before his diagnosis, when he'd encouraged me to apply for an administrative position in another district. I'd declined because Emma was still in high school and I wanted to be available for her activities and needs. Robert had understood, but he'd also warned me about the dangers of defining myself solely through motherhood. "You're an incredible teacher, Margaret," he'd said. "Don't let being an incredible mother overshadow that. Emma needs to see that women can be both nurturing and professionally ambitious." I'd taken his advice to heart for a while, pursuing my graduate degree and taking on leadership roles within my school. But somewhere along the way, especially after Emma moved to the city and seemed to need me less, I'd allowed my professional ambitions to take a back seat to my desire to remain available and supportive. Now, with Emma actively pushing me away, maybe it was time to reclaim that ambitious part of myself. The phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed. Emma's name appeared on the caller ID, and my heart jumped with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to invite me to Thanksgiving after all, to acknowledge that she'd been unfair and hurtful. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded tired, strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "I'm okay. Listen, I was wondering if you could do me a favor. Trevor's parents are coming in from Boston tomorrow, and we realized we don't have enough chairs for Thanksgiving dinner. Could we borrow the dining room chairs from your house?" The request hit me like a physical blow. She was calling to ask for furniture for the Thanksgiving dinner I was excluded from, as if my feelings about the situation were completely irrelevant. You want to borrow my dining room chairs for the dinner I'm not invited to attend? A pause. Mom, please don't make this about that again. We talked about this. It's not personal. Not personal? The exclusion of a mother from her daughter's first Thanksgiving as a married woman wasn't personal? Emma, everything about this is personal. You're asking me to provide furniture for a celebration I'm not welcome to join. Do you understand how that feels? I understand that you're upset, but I also hoped you could be mature about this. It's just chairs, Mom. We'll bring them back Sunday. Mature. The word stung with its implication that my hurt feelings were childish and unreasonable. I'm afraid I can't help you with that, I said quietly. What? Why not? You're not even using them this weekend. Emma, I think it would be inappropriate for me to contribute to an event I'm not invited to attend. I'm sure Trevor's connections in the city can help you find suitable seating arrangements. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. When Emma spoke again, her voice carried an edge of irritation I rarely heard directed at me. This is exactly what Trevor was talking about. You're being petty and manipulative, trying to guilt me into changing our plans by withholding help. Petty and manipulative? Trevor's words coming out of my daughter's mouth like poison she'd been slowly consuming without realizing its toxicity. I'm not trying to manipulate anyone, Emma. I'm simply protecting myself from further hurt. You've made it clear that I'm not wanted at your celebration. I don't think it's unreasonable to decline participating in the preparation for an event that's designed to exclude me. God, Mom, do you hear yourself? Everything has to be about you, doesn't it? We're trying to host Trevor's parents for the first time, and instead of being supportive, you're making it about your feelings. The accusation was so unfair, so completely contrary to our entire relationship history, that I found myself speechless. For 32 years, I'd made everything about Emma's needs, Emma's feelings, Emma's happiness. I'd sacrificed my own desires countless times to support her goals and dreams. And now, the first time I'd prioritized my own emotional well-being, I was being accused of selfishness. Emma, I have supported every important event in your life. I've been there for graduations and job interviews and breakups and celebrations. I've rearranged my schedule, spent my savings, and given my time freely because I love you. The one thing I can't do is pretend that being excluded from your family celebration doesn't hurt. You're not being excluded. We're just doing something different this year. Different from what? Different from including your mother? Different from acknowledging that I'm part of your family? You're being dramatic. Dramatic. Another word that felt like Trevor's influence, minimizing my legitimate emotions by labeling them as excessive and unreasonable. I'm being honest about my feelings. There's a difference. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but it felt like we were speaking different languages. Emma couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the pain her decision had caused, and I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my living room, feeling more alone than I had since the early days after Robert's death. At least then, Emma had been my ally, my reason to keep moving forward. Now, she felt like a stranger, using familiar words to deliver unfamiliar cruelty. The dining room chairs Emma had wanted to borrow sat around the table where we'd shared thousands of meals. The table where I'd helped her with homework, where we'd planned her college applications, where we'd discussed her hopes and dreams for the future. The table that had been the heart of our family life was apparently good enough to provide furniture for her new family, but not worthy of including the woman who'd made those family memories possible. I thought about the deed transfer documents, safely destroyed now, and felt a surge of relief that I'd trusted my instincts. Emma's call had confirmed everything I'd feared about her changing priorities and values. She saw me as a resource to be utilized when convenient, not as a person whose feelings and dignity mattered. The weekend passed slowly. Saturday morning, I cleaned the house thoroughly, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of domestic care. I washed windows, organized closets, and rearranged furniture, reclaiming my space as my own, rather than a museum dedicated to memories that apparently no longer held meaning for Emma. Saturday afternoon, I drove to the mall to buy a hostess gift for Caroline, something special to mark my first Thanksgiving away from home in decades. At the department store, I found myself drawn to the jewelry counter, specifically to a display of pearl earrings that reminded me of the ones my mother had worn to special occasions. "Those are beautiful," the sales associate said, "classic and elegant, perfect for someone with sophisticated taste." I thought about Emma's engagement ring, about the cold perfection Trevor had chosen to represent their love. Then I thought about Robert's proposal, how he'd presented me with his grandmother's ring, worn smooth by decades of wear, but warm with family history and genuine emotion. "I'll take them," I said, surprising myself with the decision. As the woman wrapped the earrings in tissue paper, I realized I was buying them for myself. For the first time in years, I was purchasing something beautiful simply because it gave me pleasure, not because it served someone else's needs or expectations. The small rebellion felt significant, a declaration of independence from the role of selfless mother that had defined me for so long. Saturday evening, I called Caroline to confirm my arrival time for Thanksgiving week. "I was thinking of driving up Tuesday after school," I said, "if that works for your schedule." "Perfect. I'll take Wednesday and Friday off so we can have a long weekend together. We can do all the touristy things I never have time for when I'm traveling for work." "Actually, Caroline, I have some news. I was offered a promotion at work, literacy coordinator for the whole district. I'm thinking of taking it." "Margaret, that's fantastic. Tell me everything." As I described the position and its requirements, I found myself getting genuinely excited for the first time since Patricia had told me about the opportunity. The chance to impact reading instruction across multiple schools, to develop programs that could help struggling students, to use my expertise on a larger scale. "It sounds like exactly what you need right now," Caroline said, "a chance to focus on your professional growth instead of sitting around waiting for Emma to remember you exist." Her directness was jarring, but accurate. I had been waiting, organizing my life around Emma's sporadic attention, measuring my days by her phone calls and visits. "The timing is interesting," I admitted. 6 months ago, I would have worried about taking on additional responsibilities that might interfere with family time. Now, family time apparently isn't something I need to worry about. Maybe that's a blessing in disguise. Maybe Emma's rejection is actually giving you permission to pursue opportunities you've been putting off for her sake. Sunday morning, I attended church for the first time in months. The familiar rhythms of the service, the community singing, the pastor's message about gratitude and resilience spoke to something deep in my soul that had been neglected during the turmoil of recent weeks. After the service, several congregation members approached me with warmth and concern. Mrs. Chen, whose granddaughter had been in my class 3 years earlier, asked about my Thanksgiving plans. "I'm visiting my sister in Portland," I said, surprised by how natural and positive that sounded. "How wonderful! A change of scenery can be so refreshing. Will Emma be joining you?" "No, she's hosting her husband's family this year." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "It's so important for young couples to establish their own traditions, and it's equally important for us to maintain our independence and pursue our own interests. I think it's marvelous that you're taking this opportunity to visit Caroline." Her perspective was so different from the guilt and rejection I'd been feeling that it stopped me in my tracks. Maybe Emma's decision to host her own Thanksgiving wasn't primarily about excluding me. Maybe it was about establishing independence, about creating new family traditions as a married couple. Maybe I'd been so focused on what I was losing that I hadn't considered what I might be gaining. On the drive home, I thought about Mrs. Chen's words and Caroline's encouragement. For the first time since Emma's devastating phone call, I allowed myself to imagine a different narrative about what was happening in my life. What if this wasn't just about rejection and loss? What if it was about evolution, about relationships changing as people grew and circumstances shifted? What if Emma's need for independence was actually healthy, even if it was being expressed in ways that felt hurtful? What if my job was not to cling to our old relationship patterns, but to model how to handle change with grace and dignity? Sunday afternoon, I sat at my computer and composed a careful email to Patricia Henderson, accepting the literacy coordinator position. As I typed, I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in months. "Dear Patricia," I wrote, "thank you for this incredible opportunity. I'm honored to accept the position of literacy coordinator and excited to begin this new chapter of my career. I believe this program has the potential to transform how we support struggling readers, and I'm eager to begin implementation planning." After sending the email, I called Caroline with the news. "You accepted it! Margaret, I'm so proud of you."
"I'm proud of me too," I said, and meant it. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm moving forward instead of just reacting to circumstances beyond my control. And the best part is, you're doing it for yourself. Not because you're trying to prove something to Emma or spite Trevor. You're making choices based on your own goals and values. That evening, I began planning my week in Portland with genuine enthusiasm. I researched museums and restaurants, made lists of books I wanted to read during my vacation, even considered signing up for a photography workshop Caroline had mentioned. For 32 years, my Thanksgiving preparations had revolved around menu planning, grocery shopping, house cleaning, and coordinating family schedules. This year, I was preparing for something entirely different. An adventure with my sister. An opportunity to rediscover interests and pleasures that had nothing to do with motherhood or family obligations. The change was both terrifying and exhilarating. Monday at school, word had already spread about my promotion. Fellow teachers stopped by my classroom to offer congratulations, students asked questions about what my new job would involve, and Patricia announced the appointment during the afternoon faculty meeting. "We're losing an exceptional classroom teacher," she said, "but we're gaining a district-level leader who will impact reading instruction in ways that extend far beyond any single classroom. Margaret's expertise and passion for literacy education will benefit hundreds of students and dozens of teachers." The applause from my colleagues felt genuine and warmth, a recognition of professional accomplishments that had nothing to do with my success or failure as a mother. For years, my identity had been so intertwined with Emma's life that I'd almost forgotten I existed as a person separate from my parental role. Now, surrounded by people who valued my professional contributions, I remembered what it felt like to be appreciated for my own achievements, rather than my ability to support someone else's dreams. That evening, I received a text from Emma. "Mom, can we talk? There are some things I need to tell you." My heart raced as I read the message. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to invite me to Thanksgiving after all, to acknowledge that she'd been influenced by Trevor's unreasonable demands. Or maybe she was calling to escalate our conflict, to blame me for the tension in her marriage, to justify her choices by painting me as the unreasonable party. Either way, I knew I needed to be prepared for whatever she had to say. The woman who'd spent Saturday buying herself pearl earrings and Sunday accepting a career-changing promotion was not the same woman who'd been devastated by Emma's initial rejection. I was stronger now, more centered in my own worth, less willing to accept treatment that diminished my dignity and self-respect. Of course, I texted back, "I'll call you after dinner." As I prepared my evening meal, I thought about all the conversations Emma and I had shared over the years. Heart-to-heart talks about boys and friendships during her teenage years, serious discussions about college choices and career goals during her early 20s, excited planning sessions about her wedding and future family just months ago. This conversation would be different. For the first time, I would enter it as an equal rather than a supplicant, as someone with my own needs and boundaries rather than someone whose primary goal was maintaining peace at any cost. Whatever Emma had to tell me, I was ready to listen. But I was also ready to speak my own truth, to advocate for my own worth, to demand the respect that any relationship between adults requires. The deed transfer documents were gone, torn up and discarded. But more importantly, the mindset that had created those documents, the assumption that unconditional giving without regard for reciprocal respect was the highest form of love, had been shattered as well. I was no longer just Emma's mother. I was Margaret Blackwood, educator, professional, woman of substance in my own right. And I was about to remind my daughter of exactly who she was dealing with. At 8 o'clock, I poured myself a glass of the wine Robert and I used to share on Sunday evenings, settled into my favorite chair, and dialed Emma's number. "Hi, Mom. Thanks for calling back." Her voice sounded different, less certain, more vulnerable than it had during our previous conversations. Something had changed, and I found myself curious rather than anxious about what she might say. "Of course, sweetheart. What did you want to talk about?" There was a long pause, and when Emma spoke again, her words came slowly, as if she were choosing each one carefully. "I've been thinking about our conversation Friday night, about the chairs, and about Thanksgiving, and about the way I've been treating you lately." My breath caught, as this was not what I'd expected to hear. "And I realized something, Mom. I realized that I've been letting Trevor's opinions influence how I see our relationship, and that's not fair to either of us." I remained silent, afraid that any response might derail this unexpected confession. Trevor has been saying things about boundaries and independence, and some of what he says makes sense, but I think I've been applying his advice in ways that are hurtful and unnecessary. "What kinds of things has he been saying?" I asked gently. Another pause. "He says that children who remain too close to their parents never fully mature as adults, that healthy marriages require couples to prioritize each other above all other relationships, including family relationships, that dependence on parents prevents personal growth." The words sounded rehearsed, like therapeutic language Emma had absorbed without fully understanding its implications. "And you believe that describes our relationship?" "I don't know," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "Maybe. I've never thought of you as someone I was dependent on, but Trevor says the fact that we talk so often and see each other regularly is a sign of unhealthy attachment." Unhealthy attachment. The clinical language was chilling, reducing a loving mother-daughter relationship to psychological pathology. "Emma, can I ask you something? In what way do you feel dependent on me? What specifically about our relationship feels unhealthy to you?" The question seemed to surprise her. "I don't feel dependent on you. I love talking to you. I enjoyed our visits, but Trevor says that's exactly the problem, that I should want more independence from my family of origin." Family of origin. More therapeutic jargon that created distance and hierarchy where none had existed before. "Has Trevor suggested that you limit contact with any of your friends?" "Well, some of them. He thinks Sarah and Jennifer have negative attitudes about marriage that might influence me, and he doesn't like Marcus because he thinks it's inappropriate for me to be close friends with another man now that I'm married." My heart sank as I recognized the classic pattern of isolation that Caroline had warned me about. Trevor wasn't just targeting me, he was systematically removing Emma from her entire support network, replacing her relationships with his opinions and preferences. "Emma, do you remember what you were like before you met Trevor?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you remember being confident in your own judgment, having your own opinions about people and relationships, making decisions based on your own values and instincts?" The question was met with silence that stretched uncomfortably long. "I still make my own decisions," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like Trevor has convinced you that your natural affection for your mother and friends is somehow problematic, that loving relationships you've maintained for years are suddenly obstacles to your personal growth." "It's not that simple, Mom."
Isn't it? Emma, you called me Friday night to ask for furniture for a dinner I'm not invited to attend. When I declined, you called me petty and manipulative. Those aren't words you would have used to describe me 6 months ago. Those aren't even concepts you would have applied to our relationship. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could sense the internal struggle between her natural instincts and the narrative she'd been taught to accept. Trevor says that families use guilt and manipulation to control adult children who are trying to establish independence. And do you feel controlled by me, Emma? Do you feel like I've used guilt and manipulation to prevent you from making your own choices? No, she said softly. You've always supported my decisions, even when you had concerns. Then why are you listening to someone who's convinced you that love equals control and support equals manipulation? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge she wasn't sure how to answer. Because I love him, she said finally. And marriage means compromise. It means considering your spouse's perspective even when it's different from your own. Emma, compromise means finding solutions that work for both people. It doesn't mean adopting your spouse's worldview completely, especially when that worldview requires you to damage other relationships that have been important to you. But what if he's right? What if I have been too dependent on you? Then we can work on that together as adults who love and respect each other. But Emma, pushing away everyone who cares about you isn't independence. It's isolation. And isolation makes you more dependent on your spouse, not less. I could hear her crying softly, and my maternal instincts wanted to comfort her, to minimize my concerns in favor of soothing her distress. But I forced myself to continue speaking the truth she needed to hear. Sweetheart, I want you to be happily married. I want your relationship with Trevor to be strong and fulfilling. But I also want you to remain the confident, loving woman I raised you to be. And that woman would never exclude her mother from Thanksgiving dinner because her husband found my presence inconvenient. I know, she whispered. I know that's not who I used to be. You can still be that person, Emma. It's not too late to remember who you are underneath all of Trevor's opinions about who you should be. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma slowly acknowledging the ways Trevor's influence had changed her perspective on relationships and independence. She didn't apologize directly for the Thanksgiving exclusion, but she expressed regret about the way she'd handled our recent interactions. I miss you, Mom, she said as we were preparing to hang up. I miss talking to you without feeling like I'm doing something wrong. I miss you too, sweetheart, more than you know. Can we try to do better? Can we find a way to maintain our relationship while also respecting my marriage? Of course we can. But Emma, that has to be something you want, not something you're doing to manage Trevor's concerns about our closeness. After we hung up, I sat in my chair feeling cautiously hopeful for the first time in weeks. Emma was starting to question the narrative she'd been accepting, starting to recognize the ways Trevor's demands were damaging her other relationships. But I also knew that awareness was only the first step. Change would require Emma to actively resist Trevor's influence, to stand up for relationships he wanted her to abandon, to risk conflict with her husband in order to maintain connections with family and friends. That kind of courage couldn't be imposed from the outside. It had to come from Emma's own recognition that some things were worth fighting for. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the deed transfer documents, about the decision to revoke Emma's inheritance, about all the ways this conflict had forced me to reassess my own values and priorities. Maybe the real gift wasn't the house I'd been planning to give Emma. Maybe the real gift was the lesson about self-respect, about the importance of reciprocal relationships, about the difference between love and enablement. Maybe by refusing to give unconditionally, I was teaching Emma something more valuable than financial security. I was teaching her that relationships require mutual respect, that love without boundaries becomes manipulation, that true family bonds are strong enough to weather honest conversations about expectations and behavior. The conversation with Emma had been a beginning, not a resolution. But for the first time since this crisis started, I felt like I was dealing with my daughter rather than Trevor's influence speaking through her voice. And that gave me hope that the woman I'd raised was still there, underneath all the confusion and misplaced loyalty, waiting to remember her own worth and reclaim her own voice. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the self-respect I was learning to value. But tonight, I went to sleep feeling like Margaret Blackwood again, not just Emma's mother, but a woman of substance in her own right, worthy of love and respect from anyone who wanted to be part of her life. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made everything feel possible. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my Honda Civic, along with the hostess gifts I'd carefully selected for Caroline and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. The drive to Portland stretched ahead of me like a promise of new beginnings. As I pulled out of my driveway, I caught sight of Mrs. Rodriguez waving from her front window. I waved back enthusiastically, feeling lighter than I had in months. The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked different somehow, less like a trap of routine and more like a foundation I could return to when I was ready. The highway unfolded before me with autumn trees lining both sides, their leaves a tapestry of gold and scarlet against the gray November sky. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed driving long distances, the meditative quality of watching landscapes change gradually, the sense of movement and progress that came with each passing mile. About an hour into the drive, my phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. Emma's name appeared on the dashboard screen, and my stomach tightened reflexively. Our conversation the night before had ended on a hopeful note, but I'd learned not to assume that moments of clarity would necessarily lead to lasting change. "Hi, sweetheart. Mom, where are you? I just drove by your house and your car isn't there." There was something different in her tone, an urgency that hadn't been present during our recent interactions. Not the careful distance she'd maintained since marrying Trevor, but something closer to panic. "I'm driving to Portland to spend Thanksgiving with Caroline. I told you I was visiting my sister this year. But I thought that was just something you said when you were upset about our dinner plans. I didn't realize you were actually leaving town." The assumption that my plans were merely a bargaining tactic stung, but I kept my voice steady. "Emma, when have I ever said something I didn't mean? If I told you I was spending Thanksgiving with Caroline, why would you think I wasn't serious? I don't know. I guess I thought you'd change your mind, that you'd be home if I needed to talk to you." The phrase, "if I needed to talk to you," carried weight that hadn't been there in our relationship for months. When had my availability become something Emma took for granted rather than appreciated? "What's wrong? You sound upset." There was a long pause filled only by the sound of highway noise and my own breathing. When Emma spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger somehow. "Trevor and I had a fight last night, after I talked to you. A big fight. About what? About you."
About Thanksgiving, about the way he's been treating you and the things he's been saying about our relationship. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to stay calm, to listen rather than immediately offering comfort or advice. Emma needed to work through this herself, needed to find her own voice rather than simply adopting mine in place of Trevor's. "What specifically did you fight about?" I told him what you said about isolation, about how marriage should be about compromise rather than one person dictating the terms of all relationships. I said I wanted to invite you to Thanksgiving dinner, that excluding my mother was wrong. The words sent a surge of hope through my chest, but I could hear the distress in Emma's voice that suggested this confrontation hadn't gone well. How did he respond? He was furious. He said I was being manipulated by your guilt tactics, that you were deliberately trying to undermine our marriage. He said if I invited you to dinner, he would consider it a betrayal of our commitment to each other. A betrayal. The language of warfare applied to a family holiday, as if my presence at their table would constitute an act of hostility rather than an expression of love and connection. Emma, that's an extreme response to you wanting to include your mother in a holiday celebration. I know, that's what scared me. The way he got so angry so quickly, like I'd suggested something terrible instead of just wanting my family there. I could hear the confusion in her voice, the disorientation that comes when someone you trust reveals a side of themselves that doesn't match the person you thought you knew. What else did he say? He said that if I couldn't prioritize our marriage over my attachment to you, then maybe I wasn't ready to be married at all.
He said he was questioning whether I understand what commitment means. The manipulation was so transparent, so textbook in its execution, that I felt a flash of anger at Trevor's calculated cruelty. But I also felt proud of Emma for finally seeing it clearly enough to be disturbed by it. How did that make you feel? Scared, confused, like I was talking to a stranger instead of my husband. Mom, in that moment, I realized I don't know how to disagree with him without him making me feel like I'm doing something wrong. The admission was heartbreaking and illuminating. Emma was recognizing the dynamic that had been slowly eroding her autonomy and confidence. The way Trevor's reactions to any resistance had trained her to avoid conflict by simply agreeing with whatever he wanted. That's not how healthy relationships work, sweetheart. Partners should be able to disagree about things, even important things, without one person using emotional manipulation to force compliance. I know that intellectually. But when he gets upset with me, it feels like the world is ending, like I failed at being a good wife. Emma, a good wife isn't someone who never disagrees with her husband. A good wife is someone who brings her whole self to the relationship, including her own opinions, values, and family connections. I could hear her crying softly, and every maternal instinct urged me to turn around, to drive straight to her apartment and hold her while she worked through this crisis. But I also knew that rescuing Emma from this situation wouldn't teach her how to rescue herself. "Where are you now?" I asked gently. "I'm at Sarah's apartment. I drove here after our fight last night and slept on her couch. Trevor's been calling and texting all morning, but I haven't answered." Sarah, the friend Trevor had convinced Emma was a negative influence on her marriage. The friend Emma had been gradually distancing herself from in deference to her husband's preferences. "How did Sarah react when you showed up?" "She was amazing. She didn't say, 'I told you so,' or anything like that. She just made me tea and listened while I talked for hours about how confused I've been feeling." "What did you talk about?" "Everything. About how I stopped reading books because Trevor said they were clutter. About how I gave up my herb garden because he thought it was too much work. About how I stopped seeing friends because he always found reasons why they were bad for me. About how I started asking his permission for things that used to be automatic decisions." The list was devastating in its completeness. Trevor hadn't just targeted me, he'd systematically dismantled every aspect of Emma's independent identity, replacing her interests and relationships with his preferences and requirements. "Emma, do you see the pattern in all of that?" "Yes, God, Mom, it's so obvious now. How did I not see it before?" "Because it happened gradually, and because you loved him. When someone gains your trust first, it's much easier for them to convince you that their criticism and control comes from a place of caring." Sarah said the same thing. She said that's how abusive relationships work, that they start with love and concern and slowly escalate into control and isolation. Abusive relationships? The phrase hung between us like a diagnosis neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't avoid confronting. "How do you feel about that assessment?" "Terrified. Because if Sarah's right, if this is what an abusive relationship looks like, then I married someone who's been systematically destroying my sense of self for months." The clarity in her voice was both heartening and heartbreaking. Emma was finally seeing the situation clearly, but that clarity came with the devastating recognition of how much she'd lost in the process. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. I keep thinking about the way he looked at me last night when I said I wanted to invite you to dinner. Like I was an enemy instead of his wife. Like my love for you was a personal attack on him." "Emma, people who love you don't make you choose between them and your other relationships. They don't punish you for caring about your family." "I know. And Mom, I'm so sorry about the way I've been treating you. The things I said about you being clingy and manipulative, about needing boundaries, those weren't my words. They weren't even my thoughts. The apology I'd been hoping for arrived with less satisfaction than I'd expected." Emma's recognition of how she'd been influenced was gratifying, but it also highlighted how much damage had been done to our relationship, how much rebuilding would be required. "Emma, I forgive you. But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself. What happened to you can happen to anyone who enters a relationship with someone skilled at manipulation. But I should have seen it sooner. I should have trusted my own instincts instead of letting him convince me that everything I felt was wrong. Maybe, but you're seeing it now, and that's what matters. The question is, what are you going to do with this awareness? The question I'd been avoiding finally had to be asked directly. Emma could recognize the problem, could apologize for the harm that had been done, but ultimately, she was the only one who could decide whether to stay in a marriage that required her to sacrifice her identity and family relationships. I don't know if I can go back to him, Mom. I don't know if I can pretend that last night didn't happen, that I don't see him clearly now. Then don't pretend. You have choices, Emma, even if they're all difficult ones. What would you do? The question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Emma was asking for my guidance, but I knew that any advice I gave would be seen through the lens of our recent conflict. If I encouraged her to leave Trevor, she might interpret it as vindictiveness rather than genuine concern for her well-being. Emma, I can't make this decision for you, but I can tell you that no relationship is worth sacrificing your sense of self, your family connections, and your ability to trust your own judgment. Even marriage? Even when you've made promises and commitments? Especially marriage. A marriage that requires you to become less than who you are isn't a marriage worth preserving. We talked for another 20 minutes as I continued driving toward Portland. Emma described more details of her fight with Trevor, his attempts to contact her, his increasingly desperate messages claiming that she was overreacting and that he'd been trying to help her grow as a person. "He keeps saying he loves me," she said. "But Mom, if this is what love looks like, then I don't want it. Love doesn't require you to give up who you are, sweetheart. Love celebrates who you are and supports your growth into who you want to become." As we prepared to hang up, Emma asked the question I'd been expecting. "Mom, can I come to Portland? Can I spend Thanksgiving with you and Caroline instead of hosting dinner here?" The request filled me with joy and relief, but also concern. I didn't want Emma to run to me just to escape Trevor. I wanted her to make decisions based on her own strength and clarity rather than fear. "Of course you can come. Caroline would love to see you, and I would love to have you there. But Emma, make sure you're coming because you want to be with family, not just because you're running away from your problems." Both, I think. I want to be with people who love me without conditions, who don't make me feel like I have to earn their acceptance by being someone other than who I am. Then come. Caroline's address is in your phone from when you visited her last summer. I'll call her and let her know to expect another guest. After we hung up, I called Caroline immediately to share the news. "Emma's coming. Margaret, that's wonderful. What happened?" I explained the situation as concisely as possible. Emma's growing awareness of Trevor's manipulation, their fight, her decision to seek refuge with Sarah rather than continue living in a marriage that required her to sacrifice her identity. "I'm proud of her for recognizing what was happening," Caroline said, "and I'm proud of you for not trying to rescue her. You let her come to her own conclusions rather than come to her own conclusions." It was the hardest thing I've ever done, watching her struggle with those realizations instead of just telling her what I thought she should do. But it was the right thing. Now when she makes decisions about her future, they'll be her own decisions based on her own understanding, not choices she made to please you or spite Trevor. That evening, I arrived at Caroline's cozy cottage in Portland's Alberta district. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with books and artwork collected during her travels as a freelance writer. Caroline greeted me with a fierce hug and a glass of wine, then listened intently as I provided more details about the recent developments with Emma. "Do you think she'll actually leave him?" Caroline asked. "I don't know. Recognition is one thing, action is another. Emma's going to have to decide whether she's willing to face the social and financial complications of ending a marriage that's only 8 months old. What about you? How do you feel about potentially having your daughter back after months of feeling like you'd lost her?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on Emma's crisis that I hadn't fully processed my own emotional journey through this experience. Grateful, of course, but also different than I was before this all started. I can't go back to the relationship we had before Trevor, where I was always available and accommodating regardless of how I was treated. Good. You've learned to value yourself appropriately. That's going to be important as you and Emma rebuild your relationship. Thursday morning, Caroline and I were preparing vegetables for our small Thanksgiving feast when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Emma standing on the porch with a small suitcase, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. I opened the door and she fell into my arms immediately, sobbing against my shoulder with the kind of desperate relief that comes from finally reaching safety after a long and difficult journey. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything." "Shh, you're here now. You're safe. That's all that matters." Caroline appeared with tissues and another glass of wine, welcoming Emma with the same warmth she'd always shown. For the next hour, we sat in Caroline's living room while Emma described her decision to leave her apartment, her conversation with Trevor that morning, and her growing certainty that she couldn't return to a marriage that required her to sacrifice her relationship with her family. He kept saying that I was being irrational, that all couples go through adjustments in their first year of marriage. He said if I just gave him another chance, he could prove that his concerns about our relationship came from love, not control. "How did you respond?" Caroline asked. "I told him that love doesn't require proof through isolation from family. I said that if he really wanted what was best for me, he would support my relationships with people who had been important to me long before I met him." "That took courage," I said. "It did. And Mom, his reaction confirmed everything you'd tried to tell me. He got so angry when I wouldn't accept his explanations, so frustrated that I wasn't automatically deferring to his version of reality." As the day progressed, I watched Emma slowly relax into being herself again. She helped Caroline prepare stuffing using our grandmother's recipe, laughed at stories about Caroline's recent travel adventures, and engaged in the kind of spontaneous, wide-ranging conversation that had been missing from our interactions for months. Over dinner, Caroline raised her glass for a toast. "To women who know their own worth, who support each other through difficult transitions, and who refuse to accept less than they deserve from any relationship." We clinked glasses, and I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from witnessing someone you love reclaim their strength and dignity after a period of diminishment. Friday morning, Emma and I went for a walk through Caroline's neighborhood, past craftsman bungalows and coffee shops under trees whose remaining leaves created a golden canopy above the sidewalks. "I need to tell you something," Emma said as we paused at a corner. "About the house, about your plans to transfer the deed to me." My heart stopped. I'd never mentioned the deed transfer to anyone except Caroline and Attorney Mitchell. How could Emma possibly know about documents that had been destroyed weeks ago? "How do you know about that?" "Trevor found the preliminary paperwork in your bedroom when we borrowed your spare key to water your plants last month while you were visiting Caroline in August."
He saw the deed transfer documents and told me about them. The violation was breathtaking. They'd been in my home without permission, had gone through my private papers, had discovered and discussed my financial plans without my knowledge or consent. "Emma, you went through my personal documents?" "No, I didn't. Trevor did. He said he was just making sure all the windows were locked and happened to see the papers on your desk. But now I'm wondering if he was deliberately snooping, looking for information he could use somehow." The possibility that Trevor had been calculating how to manipulate our relationship based on knowledge of my intended generosity made me feel sick to my stomach. "What did he say when he told you about the deed transfer?" "He said it proved that you were trying to control me through financial manipulation, that you were planning to give me the house so I'd feel obligated to remain dependent on you forever." The twisted logic was breathtaking. A generous gift intended to provide Emma with financial security had been reframed as a tool of manipulation and control. And what did you think when he said that? At the time, it seemed to make sense within the framework of what he'd been telling me about healthy boundaries and independence. But now, knowing how he twists everything to serve his agenda, I can see it for what it was. We walked in silence for a block while I processed the full implications of what Emma had revealed. Trevor had not only influenced her perspective on our current relationship, he'd poisoned her perception of my future intentions as well. "Emma, I need you to know that I canceled the deed transfer." She stopped walking entirely. "You what?"
After our conversation about Thanksgiving, after you told me I was clingy and manipulative, I went to my attorney and had the documents destroyed. I decided that if you didn't want me in your life, you shouldn't expect to inherit the assets I'd spent my lifetime accumulating. Emma's face went white. Mom, no, the house is supposed to be mine. You always said it would be my inheritance, and it was going to be, until I realized that you viewed my love and support as burdens to be managed rather than gifts to be treasured. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Emma had to confront the fact that her treatment of me had consequences beyond hurt feelings, that relationships require mutual respect to survive, that taking family for granted carries risks she'd never considered. Can you undo it? Can you restore the deed transfer? Technically, yes. But Emma, that would require me to trust that you've genuinely learned from this experience, that you won't allow anyone to convince you that your family relationships are obstacles to your personal growth. I have learned. God, Mom, I've learned so much about what I almost threw away. Then prove it, not to me, but to yourself. Build a life that reflects your own values rather than someone else's vision of who you should be. Make choices based on your own judgment rather than fear of disappointing or angering the people you love. That afternoon, Emma called a divorce attorney in Portland to discuss her options. She also called her job to request extended leave, explaining that she was dealing with a personal crisis that required time away from work to resolve. I can't go back to that apartment, she said. I can't pretend that marriage is salvageable when I've seen who Trevor really is underneath the charm. Where will you stay while you figure things out? Caroline said I could use her guest room for a few weeks while I look for my own place. And Mom, I was wondering if I could come home for a while after that, just until I get back on my feet financially and emotionally. The request filled me with joy and trepidation in equal measure. I wanted Emma to come home, wanted the opportunity to rebuild our relationship and support her through this difficult transition. But I also needed to ensure that she was returning as an adult daughter seeking temporary refuge, not as a child running away from adult responsibilities. Of course you can come home. But Emma, I need you to understand that the woman you'll be living with isn't the same woman who raised you. I'm not going to organize my life around your needs and schedule the way I did when you were growing up. What do you mean? I told her about the literacy coordinator position, about my decision to accept professional opportunities that might require travel and evening commitments, about my intention to build a life that fulfilled me independently of my role as her mother. I'm proud of you, she said, and I'm sorry it took this crisis for me to realize that you're a person with your own goals and dreams, not just my mother. Saturday morning, as I prepared to drive back to my own home, Emma asked the question I'd been expecting and dreading. Will you consider restoring the deed transfer? Now that I understand what I almost lost, now that I know how much I took your love for granted? I looked at my daughter, at the woman who'd been slowly disappearing under Trevor's influence and was now fighting to reclaim her own identity. She was asking for more than a house. She was asking for a tangible symbol of forgiveness, for proof that our relationship could survive the damage that had been inflicted on it. Emma, the house will be yours someday regardless of what legal documents exist. But right now, I think it's important for you to build your own life using your own resources. You're 32 years old, talented and intelligent, and capable of creating financial security through your own efforts. But what if something happens to you? What if I never get the chance to inherit what you've worked so hard to provide? Then you'll survive, using the strength and skills I spent 32 years helping you develop. Emma, the most valuable inheritance I can give you isn't a house. It's the knowledge that you can rely on yourself, that you don't need anyone else's approval or financial support to live a fulfilling life. The drive home Sunday afternoon gave me time to process everything that had happened over the extended weekend. Emma was staying in Portland to begin divorce proceedings, to establish independence from Trevor's influence, to rebuild her sense of self away from the environment where she'd lost touch with her own identity. Our relationship would require time and effort to heal completely. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight, regardless of how sincere the apologies or how complete the recognition of past mistakes. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about our future. Emma was fighting for herself now, making difficult choices based on her own values rather than someone else's expectations. She was remembering who she'd been before Trevor convinced her that her natural instincts and family loyalties were character flaws. As I pulled into my driveway Sunday evening, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from surviving a crisis with dignity intact. The house that had almost become Emma's would remain mine for now, a symbol of the self-respect I'd learned to value more than unconditional generosity. Inside, the rooms felt different. Still filled with memories of the family life I'd built here, but no longer defined solely by that history. This was my home now, not just Emma's childhood refuge, the place where I would build the next chapter of my life as an educator, a professional, a woman who knew her own worth. The deed to 247 Maple Street would remain in the name of Margaret Blackwood until I decided otherwise. And that decision would be based on relationships that honored mutual respect rather than taking love for granted. 6 months later, Emma moved back into her childhood bedroom temporarily while she established her new life as a divorced woman, building independence through her own efforts. Our relationship was different now, built on adult friendship rather than maternal sacrifice, characterized by boundaries that protected both of our needs and dignity. The house she'd expected to inherit remained mine, a reminder that love requires reciprocal respect to flourish, and that the most valuable gifts we can give our children are the tools to build their own security rather than the security itself. Sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching someone that they're strong enough to survive without you. And sometimes that lesson requires the courage to say no when yes has become expected rather than appreciated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.